I am going to talk about various issues related to automotive security and some components of the automotive security space. I thought it would be probably more interesting than talking about the components of one platform. One thing about the automotive platforms and their security is that they are not uniform by any stretch. This is because of how the automotive industry operates. The supply chain is organized in a very hierarchical way. There is a hub that's the auto OEM, something like Toyota or Ford or General Motors, and they command a whole set of hierarchical spokes that produce parts of the automobile. And the hub, the OEM, defines for those spokes what they need to do. So that provides differentiation for cars. This also provides the ability to respond to issues if there is a recall or something of this nature, and to this highly regulated space. Otherwise, a new system would be needed. It probably would be easier today to do it in a different way. This hub and spokes supply chain system had emerged, something like maybe half a century ago. But this is what defines the way automotive operates. This, of course, is a very simplified picture. But if you look at the automotive space in general, you will see that, first of all, it's considerably isolated. And secondly, there are very few standards. Typically, in a space that is so pervasive and that is used by everyone, there is a lot of standardization because it's easier to achieve interoperability, it's easier to respond to faults, it's easier to command expertise. But in automotive, it's not quite like that. So talking about some uniformity of automotive platforms is difficult. But on the unifying side, those different automotive platforms share different issues, and they share their concerns. So I think there are a lot of cross-cutting points that we can look at when we are discussing automotive security in general terms. Those points could be such as simply moving to new models, such as autonomous vehicles, such as connected vehicles, and connected vehicles have been around for a long time. In my first job after my PhD, that was not academic, many, many years ago, I actually was looking at telematics. So the quality is different, but the idea has been around for a long time. Of course, autonomous vehicles is a much newer concept. So the cross-cutting concerns are of this nature, or they are of life cycle nature. For instance, automotive platforms are built to last a long time, sort of like a generic industrial control system. It's not something that, like your telephone, you can refresh in 18 months, or like your computer, you will replace in under 3 years. So an OEM like BMW or Toyota, they are now building their platforms that are going to last for about 15 years or more. So they are looking well into the future, something like 2030. The kind of foresight that typically does not need to be anticipated in other areas. So in light of all this, I thought it would be probably more edifying to talk about, general considerations, components of the big picture, risk metrics, platforms, data components, and so on, and research topics within this space, rather than provide details of one automotive platform, because that knot will be really propagated to other areas. You are very welcome to ask questions, interrupt me at any time. If you have any questions about how the automotive operates. Well, I should probably make a disclaimer. I do not really focus on automotive. I have done a lot of work with them over time, but I do not spend 100% of my time doing this, but happy to explain anything that's of interest to you. So, any questions so far? So, of course, automotive shares the general problems for the connected environment. Ubiquitous connectivity adds a lot of concerns and risks and um, attacks to the space. In this way, automobiles are really not different to other devices, and especially not different from other cyber-physical systems, but we'll talk about it later. There is a huge proliferation of connected devices today, and one of the reports predicted that in 3.5 years we'll have 50 billion connected devices. I don't know to which extent this is going to materialize. This is to say that a connected car has a number of different connections used for different purposes, and they need to be protected to a different degree. So there is certainly a new era of computing in terms of it being data driven and very mobile. So this slide was made well, about 3-4 years ago by Cisco, and all the numbers that they predicted for 2015 have been exceeded long before 2015 arrived. As you can see, there is the general situation is that there is a lot of data generated. This data is used for a variety of things. The ones that are dealing with privacy and personal data are probably the most prominent. But machine-to-machine data allows to improve the management of all kinds of endpoints without direct decision making by humans. And that is probably a much bigger evolution than the upset that has been caused with a good reason by the use of personal data as part of some companies' business model. So new usage models also define how data is used in various environments. We have now multiple use cases for different devices, and that are really very dissimilar. I have seen papers and talks for connected cars that describe things such as, using mission-critical super secure systems from a car. How would you do that? And papers that simply described how are you going to use infotainment with a car, from a car. The technology used in both cases is very similar, but of course the fallout from the attacks and the issues and risks you need to take into consideration are entirely different. So all the environments today are connected in some way. Sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's not. We have now an integrated risk picture, and well, again, I will talk about it later. That's very relevant for automotive, where just evaluating security risks is not sufficient, because it leads to taking wrong decisions in your development process. We have a huge number of cyber physical systems, and they create issues that we don't know yet how to address. Suppose you have a connected coffee maker, and an attack that is used on that coffee maker. In general, a coffee maker may be your prized possession, but it certainly isn't something that you would die for, and that should be very, very well protected. But think about a simple scenario where somebody creates an attack that's very easy, that the automaker, that this coffee maker just stays on well, it finishes the cycle and then switches on again and again and again and again, and eventually it burns your house. That now is a situation that creates significant risks based on the weaknesses of the physical subsystem, that we don't really have both cyber risk management view or even legal view that knows how to address that. And now think about the car. That certainly has a number of very serious fallouts from unexpected effects on the physical systems, physical subsystems in the car. Those subsystems are not connected. They are operating in a sort of segregated fashion with a good reason too, but that also creates a number of flaws that makes it very, very complicated for a designer to assess the full extent of attacks that could be perpetrated against very simple, very innocent things. So another thing that is part of this maze that we don't know how to address is a risk or security or trust composition. So how do you get to measure or understand or put in the development life cycle the composite view of all the security features that a complex system of systems like a connected car has to have. We don't really know how to address it, although we're pretty good at dealing with both the risks and the security features in components of the system. So we are really dealing with a number of security problems that are extremely relevant for cars and that originate in a variety of areas. Some of it is supply chain. Supply chain today is global, and it's extremely difficult to understand completely how it operates. It's also extremely difficult to assess sometimes in real time what the implications could be of very small changes in this global supply chain. So we have a number of industrial systems like, well, cars could be used as an example of that. The industrial systems have been created, at least the concepts have been created years ago. They are meant to last for decades. And the connected features have been added to them sort of as an afterthought. This afterthought, of course, required a lot of research, requirements collection. It was very careful, but how can you anticipate without the complete redesign of the architectures, what the impact on legacy features of the ubiquitous connectivity might be? We have the Internet of Things and CPC environments, cyber physical systems environments. But in addition to that, we have different usage models. Self-driving cars is a very innovative model. So what kind of risks is it going to be enabled? What kind of ethical problems are going to arise in this environment? And we as technologists don't typically study ethics, but this, consumer, potentially very consumer tool, a car, potentially a deadly vehicle, and ethics is actually studied in great detail by a number of folks. There is a lab at Stanford, there is one at MIT, staffed by technologists that are looking at that. How does the ethics of the cars affect the decision making? So we have a much more complex interaction with the environment that we don't completely understand. We have economic concerns. If you look at the connected car, you probably could make it much more secure, probably at the expense of things such as usability and cost. In order to make secure cars affordable, you need to know where to begin, where to stop, where the relevance of highly secure features as related to cost and opportunities for deployment begins and where it ends. Again, it's an issue that no one understands so well. And on top of that, there are geopolitical issues. Potentially, those self-driving car regulations are going to be very different in different parts of the globe. So how do you create cars that are compliant with all those diverse regulations? Because the picture is so complex, what we see is that great diversity is really to be expected, at least before we make sense of this environment. Um, this work has begun in the US, for example, and different states have completely different approaches to autonomous vehicle regulations. Some are informed by emotional concerns, some are informed by technology, some are sort of middle of the road, some are harking back to the history of car manufacturers and how they guarantee safety and fallouts in this area that have happened. So this certainly is going to be a considerable issue, set of issues that's going to affect the technology development. We just don't know how. Those regulatory environment requirements include a number of things, certifications that are different everywhere and that are bound to be extremely complex for self-driving vehicles. Also, safety, that has been much better addressed, except, well, it's different when you are talking about self-driving cars. Privacy and data protection, this does not apply to all the components of the car that are connected, but it's very difficult to create a view on privacy that separates what's personal data from what is data that is necessary to operate the vehicle and take the decisions connected to driving. There is, of course, cybersecurity. And this has revealed itself in various organizations that had been created with regard to cybersecurity in cars. One of them is IPICS in the US, where all the car manufacturers came together in order to together develop a combined and unified view of threats and mitigations. So maybe eventually they will lead to some kind of uniformity in terms of car design where security features and privacy features are concerned. Another organization that, well, actually Intel and others have started is called Automotive Security Review Board, and this organization is looking, well, it literally was kicked off, I think, a week and a half ago in Düsseldorf. This organization is looking at research direction for automotive security that is sense-making and pre-competitive, and it includes a combination of technology companies like Intel and Google and car companies or IoT companies like Aries and Uber and Tesla. So there is a lot of interest in this set of topics and several ways to address them, but of course a lot of complexities on the way to doing so. Definitely we are talking here about increased attack surfaces. Well, it's already quite easy to attack a car software and sometimes hardware systems when you have physical access to the car. This is because interfaces in the cars are bidirectional. They are bidirectional for a good reason. You want to do software updates when there are issues with software systems without a recall. But what it means is that it's pretty easy, even for a layperson, with minimal help from semi-hacker community and insiders to access the interfaces and do interesting things such as activating some features or deactivating some features in cars. There were several articles that covered how through those interfaces. You could, for instance, make your limited and cheaper model much more sophisticated by simply checking the features that had been unchecked in the interface. But of course, the potential fallout of bidirectional interfaces could be much more serious. So, of course, like everything, the cars are affected by the evolution of malware. This slide comes from eScript, and it illustrates how far we have progressed with regard to hacking various types of interfaces and technologies. Certainly, it's well, uh, certainly it has become, in a way, easier, just because so many things are connected, and the framework that aggregates all those connected components is not well understood. So it's protected as well as it can be protected, but there are plenty of weaknesses, a few of them known, most of them unknown. So that creates opportunities for hackers of all kinds of systems. And the cars, when the elements are connected, they are just like other connected systems. They use similar protocols, they use similar approaches to security. So they are affected in a similar way. So if we look at a related example for home automation from a 3-year-old paper by Connor and Denning. I remember this paper because this was one of the projects that Intel sponsored for the University of Washington. It creates a picture that's similar for connected cars. You have the same weaknesses and the same attacks, but the results are different. So, well, the bottom line is that you could exploit weaknesses in various protocols and various relatively low power devices. But the result is that you can access audio and video in the home, and that's of course is true for the car because it operates in the same way. You can unlock doors or switch something on. Well, same is true for cars. You could disable security features that are connected to sometimes very important safety relevant technology. You could tamper with all kinds of devices, including healthcare devices, and of course, healthcare devices are going to be at some point integrated in the car technology. There is work that's been done in this area now, and it's probably a reasonably low-hanging fruit. You could interfere with utilities and appliances, and this is true for the car. It could be just content related, or it could be something that's much more important. So what you really want to do is to create some kind of trust that is well defined between the lowest and the highest part of the system. So this is an old slide when we started looking at the concept of trust evidence that we now are using in a variety of environments, including for the cars. So if you have applications that are located in part or completely in a large number of different environments, from low power sensors to cloud and the server, how do you ensure that those applications could be trusted across? And there are different ways to trust your environment. Some of them are enabled to by the paradigm of trusted computing and related standards. There are trusted computing standards for automotive as well. And some are informed by environments such as secure execution that are available in a variety of areas and on a variety of platforms as well. But there is really nothing in those trusted execution and trusted computing frameworks that would allow you to deal completely with a complex system such as a connected car. So something like trust evidence then could substitute to some extent to the areas that we have um, explored in trusted computing earlier. So I'm glad that Ingrid is here. She participated in this trust evidence work, and it certainly had considerably interesting results for us and the technology community. While it's too early to create a framework that would serve the whole environment and would be based on trust evidence. For one thing, it's very difficult to describe a canonical list of pervasive trust evidence components that could be used in machine-to-machine protocols. It still appears necessary for environments such as connected cars that you need to produce, verify, transmit, share, and consume some kind of dynamic evidence of trust that reflects the changing environment and the changing operational conditions of your complex system. This is also very true for cyber-physical systems in general, where a different framework is beginning to emerge that I'm going to try to address in a little while, that is called risk engineering, but it's based on very, very similar concepts. So we can look at the components of trust evidence that are relevant to the cars as a puzzle. And we found this approach helpful in creating potentially integrated metrics for something that is connected to complex environments like cyber-physical systems. So you have the user view. That's what people generally write about in the media. You have devices and components, their security features, and their requirements for trust that are frequently dynamic. You have the concept of the platforms, including their life cycle. There will be car platforms that survive for decades, and there will be component platforms that are only one-time use. You have routing and machine-to-machine areas. Of course, networks need to be trusted. There is the data side that has been extremely active today. So when we started working on this area and these topics in general, trust evidence or related issues for data were very innovative, and it was very difficult to form any useful view on how to deal with that other than general principles of security or privacy or bulk encryption. But now there is a lot of interest in more sophisticated views on this area, such as data interoperability. This has been a part of a concern and study in a variety of areas. An offshoot of this is semantic data interoperability. There is a working group that has been started at IETF that's going to look at semantic interoperability of data in complex system contexts, such as the connected car. They are going to use the data from other data interoperability efforts that have been completed that were not so semantic. Those include data interoperability view that had been done by NIST for cyber-physical systems that had been published about a month ago. It's available online now. Or data interoperability view that had been done by Industrial Internet Consortium, a nonprofit that's looking at industrial systems, including connected cars. Also, very recently, 2 or 3 months ago. And of course, there are the issues that are still unresolved, but more and more interesting to the researchers. Cross-domain sharing, composition, and in these complex environments, various views on policy enforcement. So it's very difficult to get a definition of trust evidence. It's different thing for different contexts, but examples of trust information could include anything from the classical components of a quote that is used in trusted computing. Essentially, it's a comparison of baseline configuration values with the actual configuration values as their hashed representations, then signed in a certain way and shared in the environment to, well, attest that your component or your series of components are trustworthy, to a bunch of things such as agreed upon trust levels, risk and impact analysis, or proof of validity of manufacturing, depending on what you are going to use these components for. So one item that comes up all the time when you discuss car security is the general view of cyber physical systems. There had been various attempts to deal with cyber physical systems. They are really like generic IT systems in some way, because every connected computing device like this one has a physical subsystem of some kind. Otherwise, it's not going to operate. But they are also different. So a general definition of CPS is something that has a computing component, a communication capability, and also a physical subsystem. They usually represent systems of systems, like a connected car, like energy, like aviation systems, and things like that. They have certain cross-cutting characteristics that they share among themselves, and other characteristics that they share among themselves and with traditional IT systems. But they also have great diversity, for example, in life cycles, and they also are susceptible to a different type of attacks. Well, if you think about what would be the most well-known one, Stuxnet, that was really an attack against software systems that affected physical subsystems in a way that ultimately broke them down. Sort of like the example I gave you at the beginning of this talk about connected appliances, like a connected coffee maker, only the impact was much more interesting and much more serious. So there are key broadly applicable issues that represent the foundation of, broad view of cyber physical systems today. And they include risk approaches and compositional approaches, because we are talking about systems of systems. It's easier but no longer sufficient to look at one domain and determine how to protect it, because the features that we use to protect one domain could be significantly detrimental for other domains. Understanding those contingencies is a huge, huge issue that requires diverse expertise and probably completely different types of projects, but it will need to be done at some point. So integrated risks became prominent in this area because it became clear early on that if you look at just security, you can design systems that are potentially more secure but less safe. Well, the dichotomy between privacy and security had been addressed in a number of research projects and a large number of papers. It's well known, but really the big picture is much broader for a typical cyber-physical framework. And it includes a number of components, a number of domains. Security and privacy, of course, are part of it, but there is also safety. There is also reliability, and there is resilience, and there are probably some other features that are essential for some other context. So if you look at those domains, they are definitely interdependent, and the impacts of different domains are different for different contexts. If you look at the systems security, for instance, necessary to manage, generally the domains and impacts that are necessary to manage a nuclear power station, you will see that privacy probably is not very important in this context. But safety and reliability are of considerably more importance. If you look at the end of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum, such as medical devices, individual medical devices, then privacy is considerably more important. If you are looking at wearables and connected jewelry, privacy privacy is important, but reliability and resilience are probably somewhat minor concerns. So the community had been struggling for a variety of reasons, some associated with designing systems in this area, and some associated with protecting systems in the area by various frameworks, such as the insurance systems, for instance. So the community had been struggling how to address the approaches to the integrated risk, how to quantify them, how to establish a unified model that is mutually dependent. So some areas become more prominent as we talk about this combined integrated risk picture, such as functional safety, which could be simply defined as the absence of unreasonable risk due to hazards caused by malfunctioning behavior of different systems. So functional safety is important in designing things like cars, but functional safety is defined differently in different risk domains. So maybe it makes sense to start looking at integrated risk approaches by looking at something simpler, like defining functional safety that is cross-domain. The concept that is increasingly used in the community with regard to this very complex risk and feature implementation environment, including connected cars, but also energy systems such as smart meters and aviation systems and connected healthcare systems, is something that we call risk engineering. There are other ways to address this class of issues, but risk engineering is a concept similar to privacy by design or designed in security, except that it's slightly more pragmatic. The idea is that you can include, hopefully in a programmatic way, risk considerations into the product development lifecycle. And you could inform your selection of security, privacy, safety, reliability, and resilience features by looking at the risk parameters that define certain contexts. So how can you do this? Current approaches to risk engineering are just emerging. There will be a number of bigger projects that are going to start at the end of the summer, spearheaded by various organizations in Europe and the US. But in a very generic way, and for those who are interested, I can send you a couple of papers describing the framework. There could be several components to the approach, such as the ontology part, the model part, and the metrics. Each of them draw from environments where approaches to similar but single domain technologies had been created. Well, except for the ontology, where cross-domain ontologies have become reasonably common. Integrating those three features in one risk engineering framework is probably the first step in creating a useful component that could be used to instrument programming languages or development environments. So this could lead to integrated risk metrics and eventually to integrated potentially security and privacy metrics. At this point, it's extremely difficult to look at cross-domain values in this area, even if we talk about probabilities, even if we take two areas, safety and security. The probabilities of a failure are very small for safety, and necessarily so. They are considerably larger in security. So if you create an integrated metric that includes safety, security, privacy, reliability, and resilience at a minimum, how do you marry those different probabilities that are acceptable for the same context? How do you adapt a combined ecosystem value for different contexts? That certainly remains to be seen. It's not easy, even for models that are subjectively oriented. So you also need to create a composite view. As I mentioned earlier, what we really are aspiring on is to see the metric that describes the security of a whole car. Or a whole complex device of this nature. How do you do that? There are various checklists that you could, today use to try to see what features you have implemented, how important they are, if you assigned impact to them, and then try to create a composite view of what you have in the ecosystem. But this certainly provides no guidance for development of specific features. It's the same issue that the community has been having with, grand and commonly acceptable frameworks such as privacy by design. The principles are accepted by all, but the concrete recommendations that are tying up those principles and other those principles and specific design and development approaches, let alone specific pieces of code, if that's relevant to your environment, has certainly been elusive, even though a lot of projects in this area had been funded in various parts of the globe, including Japan, Europe, and the US. So I think one of the biggest areas of interest for everyone for environments such as connected cars will reside in this area. Integrated risk metrics, integrated security metrics. So how to do that, no one knows. That sort of demonstrates, a very primitive example of issues, just to understand, just to demonstrate how difficult it is. So if you want to access and purchase content, this is a privacy illustration. It's not a recommendation for any, quantitative system. But if you were to create some kind of very, very primitive approach to composition, and what you did was buy purchase content from your car. Typically, in this case, there will be some kind of car account that is linked to some credit card account, and then is reflected in availability of the content you have purchased in various areas. So what is the view of the user privacy in this environment? When you access this content that you want to purchase from the car, of course, you have zero privacy because it's known to who the vehicle belongs, who are the likely drivers, and so on. When you use the vehicle account to do something, you maybe have some privacy because there could be 10 people associated with the account. When you pay by credit card, you have zero privacy and anonymity because obviously, well, the payment company needs to know who you are. So when the credit company delivers payment, it does not need to be, uh, you know, not anonymous. It can be anonymous because the delivery message could just say yes, it was successfully paid. And the content owner in booking sales might not have the slightest idea about who you are. So that's a very simple and simplified transaction. So how do you measure privacy in this? Typically, when we look at this area, what we look at is the data privacy. How is the privacy protected in the information about users that is stored either the credit card company or the car company or the car enablement company, or even at the government site if we are talking about access that requires certification of age or something like that. But of course, every process that you conduct today is not simple. It's never simple. It has several components that have different degrees of privacy. So this is also true for security. When you are executing any process, the components of the process have different levels of security that are acceptable or enabled for just this simple part of the process. So how can you create a composite view, of privacy in the car when the environment is so simple? What I did here, just to illustrate, I assigned indicators from 0 to 1 for anonymity that's used as a proxy to for privacy, to see what the big picture is going to be for that particular process and how you can improve it. So how you can improve it is sort of illustrated here. But of course, you need something considerably more sophisticated to deal, to even begin to deal with the real issues of privacy in cars. So let's now talk about specific areas of automotive security. Um, Examples of areas where connectedness makes a difference include some systems where safety is paramount, like powertrain and chassis, or some areas that could create inconvenience, such as climate control or additional parking tools. Uh, it includes areas that are nice to have and that provide additional services for connected cars. That's the areas that we understand pretty well now, telematics and connected services. And they include emerging and established safety systems that also begin to be operated in a remote fashion, such as rollover sensors, airbags, but also the new areas, the new sensors that are used to operate autonomous vehicles. So has anyone seen a connected, an autonomous vehicle in this room? Anyone has? Well, I guess they are still uncommon. So in my US hometown of Austin, they are very frequent on the road. So they have been for, uh, almost a year. Austin is one of Google testing grounds for connected cars. And we see a large number of them, different types, big SUVs and small cars on the road. They are driving pretty well. One interesting thing to observe is the human driver behavior, which I share when I see this car that has sensors all over it, huge boxes on top, on the doors, on the windows, back. So you can recognize it from very far away, even before you can read that it is a self-driving car. So when I see something with all those boxes, my immediate, impulse is to swerve away and drive around it and as far away from it as I can. Of course, this is prejudice because most accidents are caused by driver's error, and the amount of driver errors that were reflected in self-driving vehicles, even at this early stage, had not been significant. I mentioned this because as the introduction of self-driving vehicles is going to be you know, gradual, there will be a large population of human drivers and a growing population of self-driving cars. So the interactions between those two communities actually probably have a significant impact on the connected features, on the security, safety, and other features in self-driving cars. I know that there are several labs that are looking at those interactions, but this just demonstrates how integrated and multidisciplinary common topics associated with security have become. So if we look at connected vehicle architecture, so we see that it is a combination of internal and external networks. Some of them are trusted. They have to be. They are trusted because they are connected to safety features. Some others are not trusted, but they don't have to be because they are not connected with safety critical features. But what is immediately evident is that it is a complex system with different levels of protection. So if we look at the current vehicle system architecture, it has several components, flexible data and traditional CANs, car networks, and some other components that are illustrated here. So they have different cable types. They cost different amounts of money. They have different speeds and capabilities of links. They include different devices and applications. So they are extremely diverse, even though many of them are plain vanilla for cars today. There is very little uniformity in this environment. And just as an aside, I remember reading about someone counting the wires of in a current, not very connected car. I think it was a common 215 model, and there were, I think, about 1,700 wire-enabled connections, and that is going to grow significantly for truly connected and autonomous vehicles. So what do we have in terms of autonomous vehicle architecture? It includes at a minimum vehicle connectivity, vehicle automation, and it always includes some level of internal and sometimes cloud-based data analytics. As connectedness and automation increase, as the role of data analytics grows, so does the risk. This is the situation that we understand but don't yet know how to address. So clearly there is a greater number of potential attacks when a lot of things are connected, a lot of things are automated, a lot of things depend on data analysis. So the attacks could include traditional security attacks, but also attacks at data correctness, data quality, and so on. So making sense of this space is something that I think you guys are going to do in the next 10 years. What we did is attempt to define it. So if you look at the technology roadmap, I don't know if you can read this. There are a lot of components there associated with safety, connectivity, and autonomy. As I said, well, some of them have been created until now, but most of them are a matter of the future. So the creation and standardization, I hope, of those features will certainly include a certain and very large proportion of understanding and compensating for integrated risks. I don't think you can create a secure and safe general purpose connected vehicle without this integrated risk picture and without the use of risk engineering. So if you look at car security and related areas, they are as complex as the connected vehicles themselves beyond security and privacy. There is car trustworthiness, and that includes the ability of different, many subsystems in the car to trust each other, and for the driver or the data service that's conducting your car to understand that those configurations and data sets are trustworthy and that the car is drivable. There is also a secure car-to-cloud architecture and set of communications. This is a completely different issue from the first one, but it also includes a component of trustworthiness that needs to be addressed. There is another area that we talked about before a little bit, and this is data interoperability. So when your car is connected and self-driving, this includes a number of data sets with different levels of protection, some protected for privacy, some are simply machine-to-machine generated and not part of the privacy view, located potentially in different parts of the globe, supplementing the information and data that the car has collected internally. There is a whole security picture that's very complex in this area. It's an area of work that has gained considerable prominence today. There is, of course, data protection with so much data, internal and cloud-based. Data protection is increasingly complex. It's complex as it is based on the current European regulations, for example, but think about having some kind of generic license as a self-driving car driver and self-driving a car that you rented in China or in the US or in Mexico, where the rules are entirely different. So how do you approach data protection in those environments where you also need to have data interoperability? Well, that's a complicated issue to which I do not have the answer. So when we are talking about connected car today, typically what we are considering predominantly is content protection. The car is connected because you want to use all kinds of services. You want to listen to internet radio, you want to watch the movies, you want to do a lot of other things. Content protection has a lot of approaches that had matured over time. Many of them have been invalidated by the way the internet operates. Many of them are rendered more complex by the nature of accessing content from a moving vehicle in the way that it is done today. So this is another area that certainly will need to be addressed. But of all the areas listed here, I think content protection is the one that has some level of knowledge that is acceptable today. And there is, of course, personal security and privacy. How do you deal with security features that address your own safety as a driver, well, rather a passenger in a connected self-driving car? How do you deal with the issue of personal privacy? There are a number of areas that you need to address as you are designing connected autonomous cars. Situational awareness is one. Planning and vehicle control is another. But uh, error management is very important. Preserving your logs is both important and mandated. So about 6 months ago, the U.S. government instituted a requirement for car manufacturers where they have to use and share the data in the car generated by the car in the same way the aviation does today. So that, of course, puts significant burden on manufacturers. This provides interesting research topics for us with regard to data integrity. This decision was taken in response to Volkswagen issue with regard to emissions, where data was doctored in order to pass the tests, but it affected all the automakers. Um, so there is, of course, error management, and there are more modern areas such as managing all kinds of devices that could also increase the attack surfaces such as radars or cameras. Well, the data motion, localization, an important issue if you are trying to access information located in different parts of the globe from your car. There are, of course, issues associated with the navigation of the car, which now has very, very limited protection, as well as the design of the vehicle platform, where the main issue that it is designed for a long time and has to last, connected or not, for at least 2 decades. So there are a number of areas that are important. All those areas are being addressed, but they have attained only a limited area of maturity for the most part. So automotive research timeline has, well, this is a slide that I borrowed from my colleague Alan Taturian. It's somewhat limited to the research that he has conducted, but it illustrates the motion from practical analysis of car systems to analysis of the latest attacks and testing, of very innovative attacks in the car. So this is the hacking side. There is also the design side that is not represented here. So if we look at standardization landscape for automotive security, there is very little that has been done specifically for cars. Well, of course, there are standards that are applicable across the board, such as trusted computing, such as general cryptographic standards, such as limited standards associated with hardware security or processor design. And there are a number of bodies, standards bodies, that have been looking at those areas. But if you are looking at standards designed specifically for cars, specifically for car security, for the reasons that I outlined at the beginning of this talk, there are very few. There is Evita, which grew out of a European standard and has been, it grew out of a European research project, so it's somewhat immature, but it has been commonly used in Europe, the US, and Asia. There are SAE standards that are focusing on security. There is the TCG, Automotive Trusted Computing Group, or Automotive Profile, and areas that are similar. So the majority of standards that are used in the cars to enable security today are general purpose standards. Specific adaptation for the car platform is ad hoc and very different. So let's see, what do we do on time? So Um, I have several sort of detailed slides about the trusted computing profiles for automotive and software model associated with it, just to illustrate the trustworthiness piece, because if you take standardization, the trusted computing profile, even though it's very far from being commonly used, is probably the only standards approach that had been used. In other areas that are somewhat similar to standards, something that's applicable across the board for automotive security, is SAA guidebook for cyber physical vehicle systems. Well, again, a guidebook is a guidebook. It's very general. It does not provide implementation guidelines. It just contains general recommendations. Well, similarly, SAA J3101 hardware protected security for ground vehicle applications contain generic features that we are all familiar with, such as secure storage, secure boot. It does not provide anything new or any level of adaptation or consolidation for connected vehicles. Obviously, a lot of work needs to be done in this area. However, the efforts by various organizations, NIST, SAE, TCG, ETSI, and a few more, resulted in a list of capabilities that are considered necessary for self-driving autonomous vehicle security. They include things like verified boot, trusted execution environment, secure storage, securing the clock, while having a decent random number generation, protecting and enabling unique device ID, and in some cases protecting it for privacy, and so on and so forth. Well, as you can see, the level where the discussion is being held, when it's cross-cutting rather than specific for a small platform, is very, very, very generic. So it's an opportunity for everyone who is interested in this space and wants to improve the work that's done there. So the crypto requirements are also generic. Automotive security research was also somewhat generic. It focuses on self-healing systems or of adaptation of generally accepted approaches like paths to automotive, the use of self-patching software, the auto-optimizing software, protecting security protocols, and so on. There's interest in robustness. There are several consortia that are looking at anything from research and ethical hacking, like ASRB that I mentioned earlier, that Intel funded about a week and a half ago with other partners, as well as similar organizations that focus on various aspects of research. So I think it's time to jump to general comments. Automotive security. A lot of work has been done there. A very immature field, however. It's a field that generates considerable interest. It's a field that's extremely uneven. There are no generic approaches other than at a very high level. There is very little standardization. Even fundamental design features of different automotive platforms for security and connectedness are different. There is a lot of work done, but no work in the middle where it's the most needed. There is a lot of work done on specific issues for known platforms, like improving BMW platform, or looking at the new General Motors platform, or really generic features. How do you use paths for automotive? How do you adapt lightweight security protocols for areas of automotive, and so on and so forth. There is also very limited information flow with related fields. A year ago, we conducted, just out of curiosity, a study with 4 universities in the US where they looked at the work on hardware root of trust research in different areas, including automotive, energy, aviation, generic computing. And they found that everyone was doing the same thing, only they were not reading each other's results. So some areas were considerably further away. Some areas were just very slowly tagging along. But, well, the obvious conclusion from this is that even ensuring a minimal flow of information between the different segments would improve the results significantly. So there is clearly emerging interest in multidisciplinary topics. Well, ethics is one. I was really surprised to see a lot of literature by technologists where ethics are the main consideration. So how do you design a system when it needs to make a choice in a self-driving car between hitting a child and increasing the risk to passengers in the car? So how do you do that? Ethical issues of the introduction of self-driving cars, because most of the accidents are caused by drivers' errors. On the other hand, the technology is very immature. What do you do? Do you introduce it as fast as possible? Because generically it can improve the welfare for most users. Or do you delay the introduction until you understand the framework much, much better? So there is a plethora of related products. Well, Intel, that's definitely is not an automotive company, has a large number of products related to automotive. They, range from the processor work that's adapted for automotive platforms, to trusted computing platforms, to secure operating systems, to different approaches to dashboard, to all the way to cloud connectivity and approaches to data. So obviously Intel is not unique in this area. It's a mass market. There is a lot of interest by others as well. Any company you take, IBM, Honeywell, SAP, Oracle, the picture will be pretty similar. There will be a lot of emerging products for the automotive, and a fair number of products that focus on what is called automotive security. So where does that leave us? I think it's a very interesting situation where the view on the field is extremely immature, yet instead of looking forward, in the 7 to 10 year window on products, you already have a lot of them. And they are really end user affecting products. What do you do in this situation? I think it's a very fertile ground for the researchers, because you have a lot of products to test, you have a lot of data that's already available, but you don't have a framework that will help unify all those all those different unconnected views on the subject. So I welcome your participation in the field. It certainly needs a lot of bright young minds to make sense of it. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.